They told me to keep the fuel moving, not to slow it down with questions. But every night my ledger drifted farther from the truth. One stamped slip at a time, I watched the same requisition codes return like ghosts, approved without names that mattered. When I sealed the evidence, they took me off the audit and left the barrels to keep rolling. And the shortages came weeks later, like they had been waiting all along. By late September 1944, the Allied campaign in Western Europe had reached a critical juncture. Following the breakout from Normandy and the rapid advances through France in August, American, British, and Canadian forces found themselves confronting a new kind of barrier. Not enemy resistance, but logistical fatigue. The front lines had raced hundreds of miles eastward, stretching thin the capacity of fuel convoys, repair units, and resupply routes. While General Patton's Third Army continued to press aggressively toward the German border, commanders increasingly struggled to explain the invisible hand slowing their momentum. Fuel. The strain fell especially hard on the Red Ball Express, the famed truck convoy network hastily assembled to bridge the gap between the beaches of Normandy and the fast-moving front. Yet even this unprecedented logistical operation couldn't hide the growing delays. Reports from the 12th Army Group cited refueling inconsistencies, missing barrel counts, and unanticipated shortfalls at key depots. Among officers, confusion reigned. Among logisticians, concern grew. One such depot stood just outside the town of Le Neubourg, nestled along a temporary corridor designated Route M5. Established in early September under the direction of the 397th Quartermaster Service Company, this fuel dump was not remarkable in size or location. What made it significant, at least in hindsight, was what occurred there during a standard night audit on the 24th of that month. The audit was led by Chief Warrant Officer Walter Elkins, a man whose presence rarely invited attention. Elkins had no battlefield stories to tell and wore no decorations beyond his service stripes. He was 47 years old, a career logistics clerk from Kansas, who had joined the Army in 1929 after working as a rail manifest inspector in Wichita. To most officers, he was simply a dependable paperman, careful with numbers, quiet in manner, never late. At Le Neubourg, Elkins was responsible for reconciling barrel counts, reviewing delivery manifests, and submitting nightly consumption summaries for forwarding to AIDSEC, Advanced Section Communications Zone. Each evening, between 20 and 2 he reviewed the day's intake and outflow logs, checking for inconsistencies in fuel draw requests submitted by transportation companies, armoured divisions and engineer units operating in the vicinity. The night in question, 24th September, began no differently than any other. The depot's guard rotation was managed by the 2nd Military Police Company, and the perimeter lights flickered steadily in the autumn mist. Elkins arrived at the audit tent shortly after 20:30, having eaten a quiet meal of cold beans and white bread with the 2 junior clerks assigned to him. A fresh batch of requisition slips had been brought in by courier, some typed, others handwritten, and he began reviewing them one by one. Shortly before midnight, he noticed a minor irregularity. 2 requisitions submitted by the 709th Tank Battalion bore the same request code, V5532, but listed slightly different delivery volumes. One noted a withdrawal of 3,000 gallons, the other 3D400. More curious still, the timestamps on both slips were identical. He cross-checked the truck manifest and found no discrepancy there. Only one actual dispatch was logged for the battalion that day. At first, Elkins assumed it was a clerical error. Perhaps one of the junior officers in the battalion had duplicated the request by mistake, but when he flipped through previous day records, he noticed a similar pattern involving the 103rd Engineer Combat Group. 2 duplicate codes, one off by 500 gallons, both marked as approved, both fulfilled. He flagged the entries in red pencil but made no immediate annotation in the ledger. The war had brought chaos to every part of Army life, and not every inconsistency meant wrongdoing. Still, something lingered. By 01:15, he had noted 6 such incidents over the past 3 days, all involving units that had passed through the depot en route to the Belgian frontier. Around 01:30, Sergeant Raymond Burke, a stock control assistant, stepped into the tent to retrieve the latest count for midnight reporting. Elkins, who rarely voiced assumptions, asked quietly, "Ray, has anyone adjusted the barrel counts manually this week?" Burke replied with a shrug. "Not unless they were told to. I did Monday's intake myself, ran it against the manifest and sealed it." Elkins nodded and handed over the count sheet. "Just keep an eye on duplicate requests, looks like we've had a few." Burke, young and newly promoted, gave a dismissive chuckle. "That's war, Chief. Everybody's grabbing what they can before they get left behind." By morning, the flagged entries were filed with the standard report. Elkins did not submit an incident memorandum. There was no directive requiring one unless the shortage exceeded 5%. These were small anomalies. Barely 1,000 gallons unaccounted for across multiple units, statistically invisible. But in the week that followed, the shortage reports multiplied. Advance columns from 8 Corps arriving near Luxembourg were delayed due to fuel rationing orders. The 5th Armoured Division's daily allocation was reduced by nearly 20%, and resupply convoys were rerouted to meet emergency needs farther north. Communications between depot officers and field commanders grew terse. One message sent from SHAEF logistics staff on September 28th simply read, "Where are the reserves?" Back at Le Neubourg, the intake logs continued as normal. Deliveries rolled in, trucks rolled out, but the barrel counts no longer added up as cleanly. On the night of September 30th, Elkins once again sat alone beneath the yellow canvas of the audit tent. Rain tapped lightly on the roof. Another stack of requisition slips waited on the desk. His pencil hovered over the next sheet. Another withdrawal form with code V5532, this time from a different battalion entirely. He set the slip aside. The following days brought no clear resolution. At the Le Neubourg fuel depot, the procedures remained intact. Trucks arrived, requisition slips were processed, barrels were logged, and the nightly audits continued. Yet beneath the surface of this routine, the numbers began to show signs of drift. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. But for Chief Warrant Officer Walter Elkins, whose job was built on margins, the drift was unmistakable. By October 2nd, the discrepancy had grown to over 4,200 gallons unaccounted for over the previous 8 days. No single request appeared fraudulent, no one truck was missing. But the cumulative gap between expected and actual reserves could no longer be explained by clerical error or terrain delays. It was systematic, and it was spreading. Elkins, never one to speculate aloud, began maintaining a second copy of the audit sheets, filed separately from the official reports forwarded to Advanced Section HQ. Each irregularity was penciled into a side ledger marked simply B variance. His notes were plain, observational. No accusations, no conclusions. Just facts. 709th TB, code V5532 appears on 3 different unit slips, 924 and 929, all approved, no duplicate delivery manifests. 103rd ECG requisitions, same volume, different origin points, same approval timestamp. Repeat entries marked expedite, per field clearance with no clearance number attached. At the depot itself, no one appeared concerned. Sergeant Burke, busy with load checks and truck queues, brushed off the irregularities as typical end-of-line mix-ups. Other clerks treated the fluctuations as background noise in a chaotic supply chain. After all, the war was still moving forward. Fuel was being burned faster than it could be shipped. What's a few barrels gone astray? But the frontline story was different. North of Luxembourg, in the Ardennes sector, multiple armoured regiments began experiencing unexpected fuel shortages. The 10th Armoured Division reported halts in movement. Engineers constructing forward bridges complained of delayed diesel shipments. Even General Patton, known for pushing his logistics teams to the edge, found himself facing forced pauses. Not because of the enemy, but because of the tanks sitting idle with dry tanks. At SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, the response was cautious. Colonel William Royal, Deputy Chief of the G4 Logistics Division, ordered a review of transportation nodes and potential sabotage scenarios. Internal memos floated possibilities ranging from black market theft to misrouted convoys to breakdowns in the Red Bull relay system. One officer, more blunt than most, wrote in pencil, in the margin of a quartermaster summary, "We are losing fuel before it leaves France." At Le Neubourg, no such alarm was raised, but the language began to shift. On October 3rd, the depot received a new directive from Communications Zone HQ. Tighten dispatch oversight for priority units. Any requisition marked expedite now required secondary officer validation. The order was written broadly, leaving room for interpretation. In practice, it meant an extra signature, and more often than not, a delay. Elkins, who had already begun triple-checking expedited slips, quietly welcomed the change. But it also added friction. Drivers, often running on thin hours and tighter tempers, began pushing back. "I have orders," they'd argue. "This needs to be through tonight." Some waved handwritten notes signed by majors or captains. Others pointed to grease-smudged map overlays. Everyone claimed urgency. Few wanted scrutiny. One of the more persistent visitors was a young lieutenant from the 389th Engineer Battalion, based northeast of Rouen. He had appeared at the depot 3 times in 5 days, each time with the requisition slips bearing the same code, E7119. Each time the volume had changed. First 2,000 gallons, then 3,200, then 2,800, but the delivery destination remained identical. When asked for secondary authorization, the lieutenant would produce a typed letter signed by a logistics captain with no depot clearance authority. On October 4th, Elkins refused to release the barrels. He cited the new directive. The lieutenant grew red-faced, accused the staff of holding up field operations, and stormed off without waiting for the counterslip. No formal complaint was filed, but later that night, Sergeant Burke noted that a group of barrels at the south lot had been repositioned without notation. No theft, no damage, but they had been moved, likely during a shift change or blackout rotation. No one knew by whom. The issue was reported in the logbook but not escalated. Meanwhile, the larger fuel picture continued to deteriorate. In Belgium, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group was forced to halt advances on multiple axes due to what was described as unanticipated logistical stress. Several divisional commanders requested emergency refueling flights via C-47 aircraft, an extremely inefficient use of air power, reserved typically for critical munitions or personnel movements. Yet Schaefer approved the airlifts. Ground movement was slowing and no one could give a precise answer why. By October 6, Elkins' private B variance ledger had recorded 17 suspect entries across 8 SOT units. He had created a separate page to track code reuse, noting that some requisition codes like V5532 and E719 appeared with an improbable frequency. Others seemed to cycle across divisions that should have no overlapping operational paths. Still, nothing explicitly violated procedure. Fuel requisition codes were assigned in batches. Units often reused or amended slips during operations. In theory, everything could be explained by operational confusion or overzealous field officers or paperwork that hadn't caught up with reality. But the gaps were widening, and no one seemed willing to pause the machine to ask why. That night, a low fog rolled across the depot's perimeter. The October air was thick with diesel fumes and mud. In the audit tent, Elkins sat beside a lantern, leafing through the previous week's barrel output. His hands moved steadily, but slower now. Each number had begun to feel heavier than the last. Near 0200 he lifted a slip from a fresh batch, newly couriered from a dispatch office near Dreux. The unit listed was unfamiliar, 739th Independent Repair, yet the code printed at the top was one he recognized. V5532, again. He held the slip for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached for a red pencil and underlined the code twice. By the second week of October 1944, the atmosphere at the Le Neubourg fuel depot had shifted. Though no formal alarm had been sounded, a quiet unease had taken hold among the few personnel who paid attention to detail. The ledger books no longer closed as neatly. Field requests grew vaguer. Some requisition slips arrived without standard unit identifiers. Others bore signatures that looked rushed, inconsistent with standard authorizing patterns. To most, these were minor bureaucratic headaches. To Chief Warrant Officer Walter Elkins, they were indicators of something deeper, something the existing system was not equipped to flag. The depot itself was still operating on full schedule. Deliveries came in from Cherbourg and Rouen by rail and road, with convoys turning over nearly 70,000 gallons of gasoline and diesel each day. Drivers rotated in shifts. The stock teams worked in rain and darkness, and command expected continuous flow forward to the front. Elkins, seated each night beneath the canvas of the audit tent, was now working with 2 ledgers, the official reports for ADSEC and his private B-variance register, which had grown to 28 entries and counting. On October 8th, an unusual entry appeared, a requisition marked cross-field clearance from an unfamiliar liaison officer claiming to represent the 734th Ordnance Battalion. The request was modest, 1/800 gallons, but it included a code not recognized by depot protocol, RCL-48B. The slip was printed, not typed, and signed in blue pencil. Elkins flagged it immediately and denied release pending verification. He called in Sergeant Burke to review the routing sheet. "This one's fabricated," Elkins said flatly, passing over the slip. Codes not on any of the verified tables. Burke examined the paper, furrowed his brow, then shrugged. Still has a cross-clearance stamp, might be a new protocol. No circular came in, Elkins replied. This isn't real. It was the first time Burke had seen Elkins openly declare a document false, and though he didn't disagree, he sensed the weight in the older man's voice. Elkins wasn't raising his voice. He was documenting, quietly, firmly, one pencil mark at a time, but something had crossed a threshold. That evening Elkins submitted a brief to the depot commander, Captain Richard Moreau, outlining his concerns. The language was careful, the tone restrained. He did not accuse, he observed. There are indications that requisition codes are being recycled across units in violation of standard supply chain protocol. Multiple forms show inconsistent or non-existent clearance markers. Estimated unverified fuel loss over 12 days, 6,700 gallons. Recommend a temporary hold on expedited dispatch requests for verification. Moreau, 30 years old and recently rotated in from Logistics Command in England, received the brief with visible irritation. We're not in a position to bottleneck supply over ghost numbers, he said, glancing up from the paper. You think we're being skimmed? I'm not making that claim, Elkins said quietly. I'm saying that numbers don't match, and the paperwork is echoing itself. Moreau set down the brief. These aren't tankers in peacetime Kansas. This is a war zone. Men don't wait for triple stamps before they fuel up. Elkins didn't respond. Moreau continued. If you suspect fraud, write it that way. Otherwise, focus on throughput. We're feeding an army. The message was clear. Throughput over precision, movement over accountability. The next day, 3 expedited requisitions were processed without secondary clearance. All bore high-priority designations from divisional transport groups operating near Bastogne. One included a note. Orders verified verbally, move immediately. Elkins recorded them in the main ledger. He did not report them in the variance file. That night, rain flooded the southern perimeter of the depot, forcing the stock crews to restack over 200 barrels. Amid the chaos, a truck marked for the 87th Infantry Division was mistakenly loaded with a double draw, 6,000 gallons instead of the authorized 3,000. The error wasn't discovered until after the truck had departed. When the manifest was reconciled the next day, no one could say who had authorized the overdraw. No written request had matched the volume. No guard had logged the double load. Elkins filed a quiet memorandum titled Unexplained Dispatch Volume, Night Cycle 10-9. The document was never answered. By October 11, the situation at the front grew more strained. Engineers working to maintain the Meuse Bridge crossings reported full-day halts due to fuel ration delays. A mechanized column in the 4th Armoured Division was forced to siphon gasoline from halted jeeps to keep a forward unit mobile. The Red Ball Express began dispatching emergency tankers from deeper in Normandy, cutting directly into fuel stores originally designated for late October offensives. Inside Schaeff's Logistics Coordination Unit, whispers of structural seepage began circulating. One quartermaster officer, writing confidentially to a colleague in Paris, stated, "The problem isn't theft. It's the absence of friction in requisition processing. Too many units get what they ask for simply by asking again." Back at Le Neubourg, Elkins took an unofficial step. On October 12th, he began copying suspect requisition slips in carbon. He retained one copy in a sealed envelope marked for G4 audit, if requested, which he stored in a waterproof document pouch behind the audit tent's supply locker. It was not standard protocol, but Elkins had spent his life reconciling numbers, and numbers, when they refused to balance, demanded their own record, especially when no one else seemed to be keeping one. On the night of October 13th, a familiar slip crossed his desk again. Code V5532, Unit 739th Independent Repair, Volume 2,200 gallons. It was the 5th appearance of that combination in less than 3 weeks, each time attached to a different unit. He stared at the slip for several minutes, then set down his pencil and stood up. He walked outside the audit tent into the darkened supply yard. The barrels sat stacked in long rows, silent and rain-slick. Guards paced slowly in the distance. No alarm sounded. No shouting broke the night. But Elkins knew. The breach was not in the barrels. It was in the system that believed them accounted for. He returned to the tent, placed the slip in the variance file, and wrote beside it in small neat script, "This is no longer an error, this is now a method." By mid-October 1944, the problem no longer hid in the margins. The Lüneburg depot had not suffered a single enemy attack, not a single loss to sabotage, nor any breach of security, yet its daily outflow was now consistently exceeding its documented intake by hundreds, sometimes thousands of gallons. Fuel was vanishing from the paper trail, but not from any known depot storage yard, and never in amounts large enough to trigger automatic investigations. The system, Elkins had come to realise, had been constructed for speed, not for scrutiny. Still, he remained bound to his role. Chief Warrant Officer Walter Elkins did not alert military police. He did not send accusations to ADSEC or SHAFE. He kept filing, one notation at a time. On October 14th, he updated the B variance ledger. The count had reached 39 entries. 9 requisition codes had repeated across non-contiguous units. 3 field clearance authorizations bore no matching signatories in depot registries. 1 requisition was dated 2 days into the future. That morning, an inspection team arrived from the 436th Quartermaster Group. Officially, it was a routine rotation check. Supplies, dispatches, condition of the loading yards. Unofficially, word had spread through back channels that inconsistencies in allocation tallies were appearing across multiple depots along the M5 corridor. The team was led by Major Charles Denning, a compact, precise officer with a reputation for tightening slack procedures without triggering scandal. Denning requested Elkins join him for a private review of depot protocols. They met inside a canvas-walled operations tent, away from the movement of tankers and staff sergeants. "We've received notice that your site is experiencing tracking issues," Denning said, his tone professional but clipped. "Are you aware of any procedural gaps?" Elkins, sitting straight and still, reached into his side satchel and handed over a folder containing carbon copies of 14 suspect requisitions. "I've logged 40, those are the clearest." Denning opened the folder and scanned the slips without speaking. After several minutes he closed it and asked, "Do you have any names?" "No," Elkins replied, "only patterns." Denning nodded once but made no note. "Is the commanding officer aware?" "He's aware I've submitted memos. He hasn't escalated." There was a long pause. Then Denning said quietly, "We can't open a formal inquiry without witnesses or a trigger threshold. You know that." "I do. We're not in peacetime, fuel's moving fast, men are making decisions at speed. Some of this may be adaptive, officers bending the rules to keep their columns moving." "That doesn't make it traceable," Elkins replied. Denning exhaled, then stood. "I'll have my men do a soft sweep of manifests. Nothing official. You didn't give me these." He left without requesting the rest of the ledger. That same evening, 2 new requisition slips appeared, bearing clearance from a fictitious Depot Section B that didn't exist on any registry. Elkins withheld both. One of the drivers protested but did not escalate. On October the 16th, a directive came down from the communications zone ordering all forward fuel depots to cut non-priority dispatches by 20% until further notice. The cause cited was distributional stress due to convoy failures north of the Meuse. Elkins read the circular silently, then folded it and added it to his master file. The depot's pace slowed, but the irregularities did not. Now the discrepancies were shifting shape. Instead of duplicated codes, the new pattern involved incomplete manifests, requisitions without matching dispatch logs, or dispatch logs without recorded origin slips. Fuel appeared to leave the yard but lacked paper history. A phantom column of need had entered the system, one that had learned how to operate inside its blind spots. On October 17th, a driver from the 92nd Quartermaster Truck Company quietly approached Sergeant Burke during a loading shift. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, handing over a scrap of paper, "but some guys down near Avro are talking about ghost loads." "Ghost loads?" Burke asked. "Yeah. Empty trucks filled out as full. Paper gets signed. Fuel never moves, just the numbers." The driver disappeared before Burke could ask more. That night, Burke brought the note to Elkins and set it on the audit desk. Elkins didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the file marked Red Entries, Suspect Routing, and added a copy of the note. Then, for the first time, he wrote a cover sheet. Observed systemic exploitation of requisition flexibility. Patterns include repetition of codes, forged or unverifiable clearances, and now probable paper-only dispatch routes. Discrepancies too distributed for individual accountability. Recommend field audit and routing freeze of all expedited clearance codes within M5 corridor. He signed it with his full rank, dated it, sealed it, and walked it to Captain Moreau's field desk. The response came the next morning in a single sentence. "This is outside your scope, Chief Warrant Officer. Turn to standard reporting protocol." The seal was unbroken. That same day, Elkins was removed from night audit rotation. No explanation was given. Sergeant Burke was assigned temporary audit duties. The variance ledger was not requested. The audit tent remained, but now ran with broader tolerances and fewer questions. The barrels kept moving. That evening, Elkins walked the southern yard one final time before his reassignment to rear echelon transport scheduling. He paused by a stack of drums marked for urgent dispatch to the 5th Infantry Division. Rain tapped lightly on the lids. There was no deception in the barrels themselves, only in the belief that someone else was counting. He left his sealed file behind in a locked drawer of the audit desk. No one asked for it. After October 18, 1944, Chief Warrant Officer Walter Elkins was no longer stationed at Le Neubourg. His transfer orders came through with standard language, logistical reassignment in support of rear operations, and he was moved to a coordination office near Saint-Lô, where his role shifted to scheduling truck convoys and managing restocking timetables for ammunition and field rations. He made no protest, filed no appeal. By all appearances, he accepted the transition as part of wartime necessity. At Le Neubourg, the fuel depot continued to operate. The discrepancies did not disappear, but the way they were discussed changed. Field officers and depot staff adopted phrases like acceptable variance and operational redundancy when confronted with mismatched tallies. New clerks replaced Elkins in the audit tent, competent men but younger, less likely to question repeat authorizations or demand multiple signatures. The system flexed around the problem rather than confronting it. 2 weeks after Elkins's departure, a spot inspection was conducted by an internal control unit from ADSEC. It reviewed loading bay protocols, guard rotations, and barrel counts, but did not examine historical requisition slips. The depot was rated satisfactory under operational strain. The phrase appeared in a typed memo distributed to logistics officers across the M5 corridor. Meanwhile, field fuel shortages continued. Patton's Third Army remained stalled in parts of Lorraine well into November, unable to maintain pressure due to intermittent supply failures. Infantry units reported low-priority vehicles parked for days at a time. Engineers, short on diesel, abandoned several incomplete bridge projects, rerouting traffic over older crossings vulnerable to rain and erosion. The causes were debated in back offices: weather, transport fatigue, rail delays, miscommunication between Chomzi and Schaeff. Every theory was considered, but none acknowledged what Elkins had seen, that the system's own speed had become its vulnerability. In Saint-Lô, Elkins continued his work quietly. He was never reprimanded, never formally recognised. His sealed ledger, left behind in Le Neubourg, was never requested. Whether it was discarded, archived, or quietly destroyed remains unknown. No record of it survives in official quartermaster files. After the war, Elkins returned to Kansas. He did not write a memoir. He did not join veterans organizations. His personnel file lists an honorable discharge in March 1946, with a commendation for sustained logistical excellence under combat conditions. In 1962, a small footnote appeared in a classified Army internal review of World War II fuel logistics. It referred briefly to her requisition code recirculation issues within select M5 depots. The source document cited was anonymous. The note was never published. The barrels kept moving.